Kneeling on the harsh ground below him, his head hung, fiery bangs shading his eyes from view, Ichigo closed his eyes and took a deep breath, letting the smell of fire and smoke assault his nose as his hands clenched into fists. Slowly, he opened his eyes, taking in the devastating scenery in front of his eyes. The world was in pieces. Rubble and debris littered the ground as far as the eye could see. The broken shells of buildings stood alone in the early morning sunlight, glinting a harsh white color that seemed to drain the world. Ichigo let out a sigh as he slowly rose from his kneeling position, reaching out in front of him to firmly grasp Zangetsu's longer blade, the white cloth that wrapped around the handle a familiar comfort in his calloused hands. It steadied him as he swayed on his feet. Ichigo let out a bitter laugh as he rose to a straightened position, his muscles protesting the action. Ichigo surveyed the scenery once again, his face as impassive as stone. The thought slowly trickled into his head. What if? No, there was no way to change the past. Too much had happened, he thought bitterly, recalling what had torn his life away with no fondness. Soul Society had already been weakened by the full-out war Aizen had raged on them, which lasted 3 years. 3 years full of torture, suffering, and loss. Perhaps the causalities in the higher ranks hadn't been as bad, but souls had died by the dozen as Aizen's Espada rampaged throughout the 3 worlds, leaving chaos in their wake. It had only ended when Ichigo had finally defeated the madman, but only at the cost of his powers, leaving him stranded in a sea of isolation as the world around him faded, the world his friends and family were a part of, and yet he was left to deal with the pain on his own. He was strong after all. Right? Peace had reigned for a year before his life was thrown once again back into chaos by the arrival of Kugo Jinjo. Bringing yet again a new hope, and at the same time the knowledge that this was a gamble, a risk he wasn't sure he was ready to take. It had all come to fruition, and somehow Ichigo knew it would all turn out like this, with the Fullbringers betraying him and Soul Society finding a way to give him back his powers. He had basked in the rush and presence of Zangetsu as his power exploded around him in a brilliant torrent of ebony, ivory, crimson, and midnight blue. He may or may not have laughed a tinge crazily in feeling the power swell inside him. That was not the first night he had taken a life, nor would it be his last. Indeed, his hands were stained with the BLD of far too many. The Quincy invaded and brought with them only death and catastrophe. The first causality was the head captain's lieutenant, Chia Sasakaibe. The head captain was struck down when he confronted his age-old enemy, the Quincy King Yuha Bark. Ichigo had raced there in an attempt to stop Yuha, but he too had been defeated and Zangetsu broken in his Bankai state. The world had come to a startling halt as Zangetsu's presence once again disappeared, almost completely muted. Ichigo had almost collapsed at the feeling that once again overtook him, the overwhelming loneliness that left him gasping in fear and pain. Everything seemed to rush forward from that point. The Zero Squad arrived, taking Renji, Rukia, Byakuya, and Ichigo to the Soul King's palace, where Ichigo struggled for days trying to understand how to regain Zangetsu. Finally, he was sent home, where he confronted Oyaji. It was all finally revealed, and everything seemed to click into place. How one born of 4 races ended up in the storm that was Soul Society only made perfect sense. Aizen had seen it, and it seems that Soul Society had an inkling that power of that magnitude wasn't normal. From there Ichigo ascended to the Soul Palace, and with the knowledge of his powers he forged Zangetsu anew. The ebony blades glinting in the light of the forge, a steam rose up around them. He had little time to train as the war below was already reaching a critical state, so like that naive hero he rushed down only to be confronted with countless enemies and Yuryu's betrayal, which truly wasn't a betrayal. Yuha had used Ichigo's descent from the palace to journey above, where he confronted the Soul King and proceeded to move his sword through the Soul King's center. Thus the 3 worlds began to crumble as the being who held them together faded. It was only with Jushiro's sacrifice that they were able to stop the destruction of all 3 worlds, though they could not stop all of the effects. Yuha was sent hurtling down into Soul Society as Yukitake took his final breath, letting the worlds be saved if only temporarily. Kisuke and Mayui, in a moment of foresight, had installed a barrier to stop access to the human world. It was activated, but not without the cost of Ururu, Jinta, and Tessai's life. The gates between Hueco Mundo and Soul Society were permanently opened, and hollows as well as Arrancar came and went as they pleased, causing even further chaos. The war raged for years. Ichigo knew the final count was close to 10 years, and yet still they kept fighting. They were overpowered in a 2-to-1 situation every time they seemed to take a step forward, infusing their Bankai with hollow Reiatsu or resurrecting the captains that had fallen. They were beaten down once again. In a moment of desperation, Aizen was released from his prison cell in Mugen. Though it was confusing which side his loyalties truly laid on, he aided them as Ichigo continued to grow in power, trying desperately to accumulate enough power to defeat Yuha Bark. Finally, he had reached a point where he was in complete harmony with his powers. He knew who he was, what he stood for, and there was no bond deeper than the bond between Zangetsu and Ichigo. He had stormed forward, speeding over a land of desolation and destruction, ready to put an end to the war that lasted far longer than 1,000 years. Yuha had laughed at Ichigo when he confronted him and continued to laugh as Ichigo sliced his sword clean through the Quincy King in a sideways arc. His power began to disperse into the atmosphere as he coughed up BLD with a grisly smile upon his face as he lectured Ichigo about how he could have destroyed the world of fear, taunting Ichigo, stating that Ichigo was the one who had lost in the end. Finally, the light had dimmed in his eyes, and the last of the Quincy vanished from existence. That's when Aizen had seen the golden opportunity to kill Ichigo and assume his rightful position as king. Where once Aizen's power had transcended that of the gods, Ichigo felt no challenge as he looked into Aizen's caramel brown eyes. Ichigo saw the attack for the farce it was. The man had no longing to see the dawn. The wind had echoed hollowly throughout the streets as they charged forward. It was over within a minute as Aizen took a step and faltered before turning to face Ichigo, an eerie smile on his face. Maniacal laughter echoed throughout the silence as Aizen's body seemed to bubble and shift before lavender Reiatsu gathered around the once Shinigami. Aizen fell backwards, laughter still bubbling from his red-stained lips, leaving Ichigo to kneel in the dirt as the reality of the situation dawned on him. His thoughts had always been on defeating Yuha and saving his family and friends. While he may have succeeded in the first respect, he had failed where it truly mattered. He was utterly alone. All the souls in Soul Society had been killed, some had fallen to the hollows, and some were never to rejoin the circle of rebirth. Their very souls had been destroyed. The Arrancar who had aided them during the war were all gone as well, leaving only a few mindless hollows who wandered confused throughout the ruins. The humans were safe, but he had no life there anymore. He was far older both in mind and spirit than any human could understand, much less help him. There was no place for him there. No, this world was a lost cause. He had failed. Ichigo! You did not fail, you gave it your all. You are not at fault for the devastation that has befallen you. Old man Zangetsu spoke in a calm and soothing voice as his blissfully cool presence washed over him and he felt his body relax after being on guard for time too long. King, why do YA always take the guilt on your shoulders? Old man here is right. If YA can believe in nothing else, believe in us. Shiro spoke in his dual-tone voice as his fiery aura gently surrounded Ichigo, leaving his tired body feeling rejuvenated. Ichigo gave a small nod of his head, acknowledging what they had said, and yet, he had failed. He couldn't protect them. The world was broken, it would soon crumble without the Shinigami to maintain the balance. Why? Why couldn't he do anything to stop this? Why did they all have to die and leave him alone? What did he do to deserve this broken and tumultuous life filled with despair and sorrow? Suddenly Ichigo felt wetness in the corners of his eyes. Hesitantly, he reached up to wipe away the liquid only to find tears. No. He promised them he wouldn't cry. How could he shed tears for his family and friends when he had well and truly failed them? He had promised Oyaji that he would be strong for the rest of them. But they were gone. What did he have to be strong for when his reasons for living were all dead, every single one of them? Ichigo's power exploded out from him, swirling in a rapid mixture of steel blue, scarlet, raven, and alabaster that could only be likened to an atom bomb. The very ground evaporated under his feet as he sunk to the earth, the wind blowing fiercely, his long orange hair whipping in all directions as Ichigo's very body began to glow, his eyes becoming two pools of vibrant light as the landscape began to disappear. The very moment Ichigo was living, if it could be called that, was being erased, the very laws of space and time ripped apart by Ichigo's own sheer loss, will and power. Ichigo let out a soul-piercing cry as every single drop of his power exploded out from him like a supernova the size of the sun. And then Ichigo knew no more as his conscience slowly faded to black, the concerned voices of his Zanpakuto becoming distant in his mind as he thought of his family and friends one last time before succumbing to the darkness. X. His whole body ached. What happened? The last thing Ichigo remembered was. Suddenly Ichigo's eyes flew open as he recalled what had happened, what little he could understand. He had lost control of his power and his emotions. He remembered thinking about his family and friends with Zangetsu's distant voice in the background as his vision faded to black. Zangetsu! Ichigo's mind recalled his two Zanpakuto desperately searching his inner world for his two trusted companions. Relax, Ichigo, we are here, though I'm not sure where here is. Ichigo felt his shoulders sag in relief knowing that his Zanpakuto were with him. He never wanted to feel that crushing loneliness again. His very world had tunneled in around him, and yet when they were together Ichigo felt like he had a wall of iron behind him silently supporting him and keeping him upright. Or King, don't get so sappy on us, you know we'll always be here for YA. Ichigo could only nod his head, trusting in their words wholeheartedly as he surveyed the room he was resting in. Warm oakwood paneling made up the walls and provided a small sense of comfort to Ichigo compared to the white of cold stone walls. On the far side of the room a pair of shoji doors stood slightly open, letting a flash of green seep in and a gentle breeze travel through the large room. The bed had soft blankets of cotton which took away the chill of the light breeze and left only a cozy warmth. Beside the bed, resting against the wooden walls, was Zangetsu in his sealed state. The ebony blade glowed softly in the mid-afternoon light which peeked through the shoji doors. Ichigo's long flame-colored hair swirled lightly in the breeze. His lengthy bangs shadowed his eyes as Ichigo took a deep breath, tentatively trying to feel his Reiatsu. Closing his eyes, Ichigo let his Reiatsu surround him. It was largely depleted, leaving a set wariness in his bones as he slowly let small tendrils stretch out to feel the area around him. He needed to know where he was and what was happening. He let out a quiet sigh of relief when he felt the presence of Soul Society rather than the empty nothingness he had come to know. Granted, this Soul Society was different. It felt younger, if he could describe it as anything. Suddenly the soft sound of footsteps appeared outside the other set of shoji doors. Ichigo's eyes snapped open as he held his breath in tense anticipation. Slowly the shoji doors slid open inch by inch to reveal the person behind the light wooden frame. Ichigo let out a sharp breath at the visage that greeted him. Spiky raven hair stuck up untamably, highlighting the wise grey eyes and carefree smile below. An ebony shihakusho swirled lightly in the breeze, the lieutenant badge of the 13th glowing brightly in the gentle sunlight. The Shiba clan crest stood out boldly in black on his left arm as he finished opening the door. "Oh, you're awake," Captain Unohana said. "You probably wouldn't be awake for a few more days, what with your Reiatsu being almost completely depleted." Kaion Shiba spoke in a fast voice, his eyes alight with sudden energy like a puppy released to run free. Ichigo stared at the Shiba head with mute shock as his mind tried to process what he was seeing. Kaion Shiba had died long ago, killed by Aizen's treachery, and yet here he stood in front of him, alive and as exuberant as ever. There were very few explanations that seemed plausible, ranging from it all being a dream to time travel, and yet what other explanation was there? Gently Ichigo reached out his Reiatsu in the barest of caresses to feel for certain if this was really the Kaion Shiba and not an illusion like Kyoka Suigetsu was capable of producing. Ichigo's shoulders visibly relaxed once he had affirmed that this was indeed the 13th Division's lieutenant, though Kaion showed no signs of feeling Ichigo's soft prodding. X. Kaion quirked his eyebrow at Ichigo's peculiar actions, but shrugged it off before studying the young man in front of him. Fiery orange hair cascaded down his back and his bangs gently shadowed soft chocolate eyes that were filled with sorrow, pain, and a wisdom beyond years. His face, much like Kaion's own, they could be twins, rested in an emotionless frown as he looked at Kaion with something akin to confusion. Pale skin seemed to glow unhealthily in the quiet sunlight as the man moved to sit up, revealing a heavily scarred chest as the blanket slid down to pile at his waist. A visible shiver racked the young man's frame and Kaion quickly sprung to action. "There's no need to be in such a hurry, you should rest," Captain Unohana said. "You would probably be sore for a few more days, not to mention you won't be up to your full strength." Kaion spoke in a soothing voice as he moved closer to the Oranget, who flinched slightly at the mention of Unohana and not being up to full strength. Reluctant and tense, he let Kaion help him move into a more comfortable position where he could see through the crack in the shoji doors. It led into a small garden full of lush greenery in the afternoon sun, with a warm brown tiled path leading off into the distance. Kayan sheepishly rubbed the back of his head as he looked into the deep pools of chocolate before saying, I never got your name? Ichigo? The swift reply in a deep voice with soft undertones that spoke of patience and strength. It was the voice one would perhaps expect from the leader of an army. One who could command men with only a single word, more powerful than yelling at the soldier. It reminded him of the head captain. Kayan smiled at Ichigo's name, frowning for a second as he acknowledged that the Oranget had not given a last name. Kayan put his hand out in front of Ichigo and with a brilliant smile said, I'm Kayan Shiba, head of the Shiba clan, but you can call me Kayan or Lord Awesomeness. A ghost of a smile danced across Ichigo's face as he reached out and gave Kayan's hand a firm shake before he said in pleasant tone of voice, It is nice to meet you, Kayan-san. I did not say Kayan-san was acceptable. Kayan said, his voice rising slightly as a small flicker of light entered Ichigo's sorrowful eyes, and Kayan smiled before looking around in fear, hoping Kukaku had not heard him. As she would surely hurt him for disturbing their guest, or worse. X. As the day seemed to draw to an end, lush reds and yellows fading into midnight blue, Kayan stayed beside Ichigo on the comfortable bed as they talked of Soul Society. Ichigo's eyes remained curious as Kayan rambled on about his daily life in Soul Society and its eccentric captains and lieutenants, with Ichigo jumping in every few minutes to ask a question about a certain captain or why Kayan believed it was a good idea to drink 3 bottles of sake before an important ceremony commenced. In hindsight, it was definitely not one of his proudest moments. As Kayan turned to face Ichigo, prepared to ask him a few questions, the Oranget let out a small yawn, his hand daintily reaching up to cover his mouth as eyes shuddered close for a moment before blinking awake once again. Kayan let out a small laugh at the sight before slowly standing up, wincing at his popping joints, and said, I'm keeping you awake. I'll let you get to sleep now. You must be tired and your body still needs to replenish your Reiatsu. If you need anything, I'll be in the room at the end of the hall on your left. We can talk more tomorrow, figure out what you want to do and where we go from here. With those parting words, Kayan sauntered from the room, lightly closing the shoji door and padding down the hallway. Coming to a stop, he turned to the left and knocked lightly on the door, waiting for the occupant to answer. A female voice called out a light come in, and Kayan slid the door open, stepping into the warm room. His eyes glanced over the crimson walls and sparsely placed furniture that littered the room before landing on his sister, who was sitting cross-legged on her bed staring out the open window, the evening breeze rustling her ebony locks. Kukaku shifted slightly, turning to face Kayan as a small smile settled on her face at the sight of her older brother. Her pale skin seemed to glow in the candlelight of the room as Kayan took a few steps inside the room, gently pushing the door shut. I talked to him. His name is Ichigo. Kami Kukaku, he could be my twin. And his eyes, they're so haunted, full of pain, sorrow, and yet determination still shines through them. Even as he talks, he carries himself with a quiet strength. X. Kukaku listened to Kayan's words carefully, taking in the expression on her brother's face. She had yet to meet Ichigo, but already she could see that this wasn't some Rungakai brat. Carefully she regarded Kayan, taking in the slight bags under his eyes and his relaxed posture, a change from the tense shoulders he had paraded around with the last few days, before saying, What do you want to do, Kayan? We don't know him yet, we can't help him until we know how to. Kayan seemed to grimace at her sharp tone of voice before turning to look out the window at the crescent moon rising in its slow ascent. I don't know, Kukaku, the look in his eyes, there's so much pain, and I want to help him in any way I can, even if it's just getting Ichigo back on his feet. Kukaku only nodded slightly before saying, Give him a few days, then we can talk and see what our course of action will be. Kayan nodded, padding over to his sister to place a feather-light embrace on her forehead before slowly gliding towards the door and leaving the room with a softer click. Kukaku turned once more to stare at the coming darkness as the fireflies slowly flickered into existence. Quietly she decided to go and meet Ichigo the next day. X. Kayan rested slightly against the wall, his head tilted upwards as his eyelids fluttered close. What Kukaku said was true, and yet Kayan truly pondered on her words, wondering what he knew about Ichigo, which was next to nothing. X. Flashback X. Kayan slowly ambled along under the eaves of ancient giants, enjoying the calm stroll throughout Rungakai, one of the more pleasant districts with lovely scenery, as the night seemed to steal away the fading light. His mind leisurely went over the day's events. It had been relatively normal, by the definition of normal. Soul Society said otherwise. It was just crazy day, although Yukitake had suffered from another attack. They were lucky it was only a light attack and Yukitake was able to get back to work after resting for a little while. The air seemed to pick up in speed as the leaves above him rustled like the growling of a creature lost in myth. Startled, Kyan looked up from where his gaze had drifted to the horizon. The sky, once dark, seemed to glow immensely as if the sun had risen and was expanding. A soft hum seemed to fill the air in slow pulses, and the ground began to shake under his feet as if a kami walked among them. Suddenly the light began to grow so bright that Kyan hastily brought up his arm to shield his eyes. The pulsing reached its peak, crashing upon his ears like a tsunami, bringing Kyan to his knees. As the echo of a bell that has been rung fades, the noise began to die down, and the bright light faded into inky darkness once again. Hesitantly, Kyan removed his hands from where they had rested over his eyes. Ringing still echoed in his ears as he surveyed the area, looking for any indication as to what had happened. Not far away, a vaguely human-shaped blob appeared in the distance. Apprehensively, Kyan carefully padded towards the still figure splayed on the soft grass. A shock of orange became visible against the outline of night. Hurrying his steps, Kyan quickly crouched down beside the prone figure. Remnants of clothing barely covered the young man as his chest rose and fell ever so slightly, as if the slightest pressure could crush the breath out of him. The young man looked fragile, an expression of pain twisted onto his face as thick raven lashes twitched and pale pink lips formed a small frown. Slowly, Kyan brought his hand up to rest on the young man's neck, checking for a pulse. Patiently, Kyan waited until he felt it light and barely there, like a butterfly on a windy day trying to outfly the wind only to fall. Kyan's worry skyrocketed, and he carefully picked up the oranget, wincing at the light form in his arms. He moved as fast as his legs could carry him, heading towards the Shiba compound. Once inside, he hurried towards one of the guest rooms and gently set the oranget on the soft cotton sheets. "Shiba Dono!" one of the servants exclaimed as they paused in the doorway, seeing the flash of orange resting on the simple bed and Kyan's flustered state. Kyan turned to the young woman and in an urgent tone said, "I need you to contact Uno Hanataisho and tell her to come here immediately. It's an emergency." The servant nodded and scurried away in a rush as Kyan returned his focus to the oranget, whose breath was becoming loud and labored. Broken gasps and moans echoed throughout the small wooden room as Kyan studied the young man in concern. Trying to help in any way possible, Kyan shifted his reiatsu to that of calming and peace, letting the negative emotions he felt be buried behind a barricade. Slowly the oranget stopped shifting and he quieted once more with a soft sigh. At that moment the doors behind him slid open and Uno Hanataisho's powerful reiatsu saturated the small room. Uno Hanataisho quickly strolled to the young man's side, her reiatsu in an instant providing a comforting aura as she ran a diagnostic over the oranget. X. Kyan shook his head, partially in anger and partially in sadness at what he had seen. The young man was covered in scars. Far too many intricate ivory lines danced across his body, and too often had the skin healed incorrectly. It made him shudder thinking about how those scars came to be. Shaking himself from his musing, he loosened his clenched fists and turned to face Uno Hanataisho, who was looking at him expectantly. Letting out a soft breath, he nodded, ready to hear what the ebony-haired captain had to say. He has suffered multiple lacerations all over his body. Though most are old and very few have happened recently, he is suffering from severe reiatsu depletion. With any less reiatsu he would be dead. When he wakes up, make sure he stays in bed and does not stress himself too much. I will come to check on him soon after he wakes. Kyan nodded his thanks as the fearsome captain swept through the door, pitch black hair flying out behind her. Turning to the oranget, Kyan rubbed a tired hand over his face before making his way out, shutting the door with a soft click as he turned to face his younger sister, who stood with her arms crossed staring at the door with a pensive expression. X flashback and X. Pushing himself off the wall, Kyan slowly padded towards his room, feeling like the weight of the world rested on his already weighed down shoulders. The mystery Ichigo presented plagued his mind as he slipped into bed, waiting for sleep to overtake him. X. Ichigo slowly pushed himself into a sitting position, his shoulders shaking, breath coming out in short broken gasps. Running his hands through silky long locks, Ichigo tried to calm his breathing, basking in the calming feel of his Zanpakuto as the last dredges of the nightmare faded into the back of his mind. Raising his hand in front of his face, Ichigo studied the slightly shaking appendage before letting out a soft sigh. Slumping against the wall at his back, Ichigo stared at the soft sunlight peeking in through the partially opened shoji doors. The peaceful atmosphere settled over Ichigo, and unbidden a small smile crept onto his face as he stared at the flashes of emerald green and sapphire blue skies. Once more footsteps sounded outside the door, disrupting the once peaceful atmosphere as Ichigo schooled his expression into one of impassiveness. The tensing of his shoulders was the only indication of the grief he felt at the visage that greeted him. Raven hair and youthful grey eyes greeted him as bright red stood in harsh contrast to her pale skin. Slowly Ichigo raked his eyes over Kukaku, taking in both of her arms whole and in the flesh, the stress lines that had once creased her forehead gone, and eyes full of laughter and light. Kukaku strode into the room until she was standing directly in front of Ichigo, arms crossed over her chest to display diamonds, and yet the soft smile on her face betrayed her intentions. Her melodious voice soon filled the small room as she said, "The name is Kukaku Shiba, but you can call me Kukaku. Shiba is too polite." Ichigo nodded his head, hiding the barest of smiles splayed across his face before in a soft voice he said, "It is very nice to meet you, Kukaku-san. As you likely already know, I am Ichigo." She let out a small grumble at the affixation, mumbling about DMN brats before looking at Ichigo curiously. "Ichigo as in strawberry?" Though her question seemed to be laced with innocence, a playful light danced in her eyes, eyebrow raised as if to challenge him. Ichigo let out a quiet scoff. No matter where he went they could never get his name right, and yet perhaps he did not deserve his name anymore. He had failed at the title given to him by his mother. A small cough shook him from depressing thoughts, and Ichigo turned to look into Kukaku's silver eyes, and said, "It means number one protector, though I doubt I am worthy of the name now." A concerned look passed over Kukaku's face, but she did not push him for answers, and he gave none. A tense silence filled the room as the two occupants waited for the other to make the first move. Finally Kukaku let out a heavy sigh and plopped beside Ichigo on the comfy bed. Scrubbing a hand over her face, she leaned back on the palms of her hands and stared at the wooden ceiling above. "Ichigo, do you remember how you got here?" Kukaku asked. Ichigo tensed beside her, his mind running a mile a minute, debating over the truth or a lie which would lead to many more lies. That and the truth of his arrival was obscured and uncertain. Ichigo let out a soft sigh. A half-truth was better than a lie, and Kisuke always said he couldn't lie anyways. It's blurry, some things seem clearer than others. I can remember my family, but I have no clue as to how I got here. It's like an empty void. Kukaku nodded slightly, turning to look at Ichigo with a calculating look in her eyes, before she nodded once again and said, "Your family, will they be looking for you?" Pain flashed briefly through Ichigo's eyes before his impassive expression rested on his face once more. Ichigo turned his head slightly to look out through the shoji doors at the lush garden outside before, with a soft sigh, he said, "Once, but they have all passed away." An undercurrent of emotion hid in Ichigo's voice, but Kukaku did not catch it. Her eyes flashed briefly to the door, a small frown resting upon her face before she decided to change the topic. "Uno Hanataisho is coming today to check up on you, and she recommends that you stay here for at least 3 weeks before you get back on your feet. Hopefully we can give you a tour of the compound soon, but Uno Hanataisho can be pretty strict." X. She laughed slightly at the end of her sentence before her eyes darted to look at Ichigo, trying to catch his reaction, however minuscule. To her surprise, he let out a small groan, his head dipping forward like an emotional teen at the prospect of Uno Hanataisho coming to give him a checkup. Kukaku couldn't help the giggle that escaped her at the sight of the stoic man hunched over like the world was ending. A sharp movement of his head and small glare was directed her way before he shook his head, and a small smile that spoke of longing settled on his face. As Kukaku prepared to speak once more, the light shoji door slid open with a soft hiss as Uno Hanataisho stepped through the door, snowy robes flowing behind her and ebony hair settled on her shoulders. Ichigo tensed slightly beside Kukaku as Uno Hanataisho's fearsome presence filled the room and her charcoal eye settled on Ichigo. Kukaku swiftly stood, padding towards the door and passing Uno Hanataisho, not wanting to get in the way of her checkup or the fearsome woman herself. Turning slightly and locking eyes with Ichigo's chocolate one, Kukaku said, "Remember Ichigo, if you ever need anything don't be afraid to ask." With those parting words, Kukaku swirled from the room and turned left, intent on finding Ganju and convincing him to cook dinner tonight. After all, his food was always great comfort food. X. Ichigo shuddered slightly as Kukaku left him alone in the small room with Unohana, who pinned him down with an icy stare as if daring him to try and flee the room. Ichigo let his tense shoulders slump slightly in defeat, and Unohana's tense aura disappeared, replaced with one that spoke of comfort and healing. "May I ask what your name is?" Unohana's melodious voice flowed throughout the room as she took another step inside the small room, casting small shadows on the far wall. Ichigo watched her movements with a trained eye before replying, "Ichigo." The captain of the Force eyes drifted over Ichigo, sending shivers down his spine as she observed the deep violet bags under his eyes and his pale skin. Unohana nodded to herself and took in a soft breath as the captain spoke again. "Ichigo, I'm going to be checking your Reiatsu levels and your overall physical health. Please remain calm. I do not wish to hurt you. Whatever happens in this room stays in this room." Unohana's honeyed voice faintly lilted through the room, and Ichigo let his head dip in a slight nod as the healer stepped closer, casting shadows over Ichigo as the view of the garden disappeared behind folds of ebony and ivory. X. Kukaku leaned against the smooth wall behind her, trying to hear the soft words that trailed through the wall unclearly. The Shiba princess wished and both dreaded to hear the news Kion would bring once he was finished conferencing with Unohana Taisho. Kion was correct in the sense that Ichigo definitely needed some help. She was unsure though of the help they could provide. Ichigo seemed to hide himself behind a wall of iron, letting only the barest glimpses of his true self peek out. The grief and loneliness that plagued his voice when he talked about his family echoed softly in the back of her mind as her fingers impatiently drummed upon the wall behind her. Finally, after an eternity of waiting, the doors beside her slowly slid open at an agonizing pace. Unohana Taisho glided out of the room, raven hair cascading behind her. She nodded briefly to Kukaku before, in a flash of Shoenpa, she was gone, leaving only a slight breeze in the wake of her presence. Turning slightly, Kukaku peered through the door frame into the dark room where a sparse few candles illuminated the shadowed study. Kion was hunched in his large chair, elbows resting on the desk covered with paperwork as his hands held up his head. "Kion?" Kukaku called out into the silence of the room as the candles flickered, sending shadows dancing across the walls. Kion slowly lifted his head from his hands, blinking rapidly as his eyes adjusted to the sudden influx of light. Kukaku watched as her brother slowly heaved himself out of his chair before padding over to Kukaku and pulling her into a tight hug. Kion lightly shook in Kukaku's arms, burying his face in her neck as Kukaku was quick to wrap her arms around him, holding him tighter. After a few minutes of silence, Kion pulled away, taking a few steps towards the door before turning to Kukaku, and in a quiet voice he said, "Walk with me." Kukaku nodded and followed her brother as he led her to the backyard and followed the small path of silver rocks till he was standing beside a small pond of clear water which reflected the luminous moon hanging in the sky as the stars surrounded it, twinkling ever so slightly. Kion perched on a small bench beside the pond with grass tangling around the legs and moss enshrined in the stone. He made a swift gesture for her to join him with her hands, and she plodded over and joined him on the bench, shivering slightly at the feel of cold stone below. "I want to help him so bad. But damn it, Kukaku, I don't know what to do. How can I help him?" Kion's sudden outburst shocked her slightly as her head whipped around to stare at her brother, whose head was bowed once more and his hands clenched into fist in his lap. Kukaku sighed, trying to think of an answer as her petty hands covered Kion's own larger ones, grey eyes turning to meet charcoal ones. "We can't help him if he's in District 57 of Rungakai living on the street, but you could offer to adopt him into the clan. He no longer has any family left as they have all passed away. He obviously has some Shiba BLD with the way he looks exactly like you. If he lived with us, you could keep an eye on him and he could even go to the Shinigami Academy. I think the best way for you to help him, Kion, is to be yourself. Ichigo has such pain and darkness in his eyes. He needs someone to brighten his life and keep his mind away from depressing thoughts." Kion stared into Kukaku's eyes in shock before pulling her in for another hug. This time of happiness, soft laughter emitting from Kion's lips before he pulled away, a relieved smile on his face and light dancing in his eyes. "You should probably be getting to bed. I'll come inside shortly," Kion said as he turned, tilting his head up to look at the ethereal moon above. Kukaku giggled softly before standing up and shaking the cold from her bones. She padded softly over to Kion and pressed a gentle embrace to his forehead, whispering a soft good night, before turning away and heading inside to the warmth of the house. A soft yawn alerted her of her need for sleep as she strode towards her room intent on getting some rest. Kyan paced slightly outside Ichigo's door, his shoulders tense with anticipation as the question he wanted to ask circled through his mind, constantly begging to be asked. Taking a deep breath, Kyan pulled himself up and stepped forward, sliding open the light wooden frame with ease. Coffee-colored eyes swung to meet his own as Ichigo shifted slightly into a sitting position facing Kyan. Letting out a soft sigh, Kyan padded further into the room and slumped into one of the chairs beside the bed. Concern flashed in Ichigo's eyes at Kyan's actions, and the small but sincere expression hardened Kyan's resolve. Ichigo, Kukaku tells me that your family has passed away. I'm sorry for your loss. I would like to offer to adopt you into the Shiba clan. This not obligatory, and don't feel like you have to as a favor or to pay a debt. If you already have friends you stay with, or if you live alone, then please, when you are ready, go back to that place. But if you do not, the option is here. We won't pressure you into anything you don't want to, we simply want to help you. Plus, with the way you look like my twin, it's strong to say you don't have Shiba BLD. Ichigo's eyes widened in shock as Kyan spoke, his mouth opening and closing comically for a few seconds before it snapped shut, and he turned a serious expression on Kyan, a thoughtful expression etched on his face as orange locks fell to cover chocolate orbs from sight. His soft baritone voice filled the room as he asked, "Can I have some time to think? This is a huge decision." Kyan nodded, standing up and brushing imaginary dust from his robes before he paused at the door, turning to Ichigo, who was looking once more into the garden, and said, "Take as much time as you need. When you are ready, tell me." With those words, Kyan swirled from the room, the slight tension releasing from his shoulders in the knowledge that Ichigo was at least considering it. His feet echoed softly on the wooden floors as sunlight streamed through a nearby window, giving the pale wood a golden glow. It was all up to Ichigo now. Whatever he decided shaped their futures from this moment forward. There were two winding paths he could choose from. Ichigo stared at the ceiling, enshrouded in darkness, his mind overcrowded with thoughts that swirled around each other in a constant whirlwind that plagued his mind, withholding sleep from him. Not that sleep ever came easy to Ichigo now, always his sleep was plagued with nightmares and memories of the past. The question was whether he was to join the Shiba clan and accept their offer of adoption, or find another way in one of the Rungakai districts. If he left after he finished healing, he would be an unknown, a mysterious man who stayed in the Shiba household for only a time before disappearing, barely of notice to Aizen and his plans. Ichigo would be able to work from the shadows like a puppet, moving the pawns on the chessboard into the perfect position, and didn't that idea disgust him slightly and go against everything he's ever stood for? He could train in private, not having to worry about nosy older brothers breathing down his neck, questioning his every move. Zangetsu would be free to materialize often without causing great alarm. But he would be alone except for his Zanpakuto. If he was injured gravely, it would be unlikely that he could heal it. He could heal basic to minor injuries, but he was nothing like Hanataro, who was born with a healing touch. He would not be able to keep track of Aizen from such a difference without looking suspicious, and it would be troublesome to sneak in and out of Soul Society repeatedly. Ichigo would not be familiar with everyone. In a moment of indecision, they would choose Aizen, who they knew and respected, over Ichigo, a mystery, any day. If he accepted Kyan's gracious offer, he would have the rights of a noble and be able to have the perks that came with the title. Ichigo would be able to go through the Shinigami Academy and rise through the ranks naturally, in the process learning some things he never knew, while the rest would be undoubtedly boring. Gaining trust would be an easier matter if he knew the occupants of Soul Society as Ichigo Shiba. Though having Unohana breathing down his neck seemed slightly troublesome, it would also be beneficial in the sense that if Ichigo was ever injured, she would make sure he healed no matter what. The slight problem with that was the fact that Isshin still resided in Soul Society from what Kyan said, and there was the chance that he might meet his Oyaji. Not to mention the various other captains and lieutenants he fought with during the course of the war. Plus the fact that Kyan seemed to already mother hen him, and the matter would only grow worse if he was adopted and under Kyan's so-called wing. Isn't it obvious which one is the better option, King? Listen to what YA Heart is telling YA. Shiro's dual tones voice rasped throughout his head while Ichigo closed his eyes, letting his conscience sink into his inner world. Shiro was sitting on one of the many skyscrapers that lined his inner world. Now, though they were cracked with many of the clear glass windows gone, exposing the shells of the building standing ominously in the soft pattering of the rain. Other buildings were gone completely, the debris and rubble where they once stood a large pile. The sky flashed violet as lightning streaked across the heavy cloud swollen with rain. Ichigo took a deep breath to calm his emotions before turning to Old Man Zangetsu, who was standing in the distance on his usual lightning rod. Ichigo, you know what the answer you seek is. Stop denying yourself this opportunity. When have you hesitated, knowing it will lead only to death and sorrow? Move forward and let your resolve strengthen you. The Quincy portion of his power's deep baritone rumbled throughout the city, and Ichigo nodded, laying down on the cool metal below and looking at the tempestuous sky above, colored in flashes of midnight blue, lilac, gold, and charcoal. His mind made up, Ichigo let himself sink into the presence of his inner world as tired eyes slid shut and a soft exhale left his lips. I would like to accept your gracious offer to adopt me into the Shiba clan, Kaian-san.